King of the Dragons feels like a beat 'em up that was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. It also kind of feels like I'm playing a beat 'em up version of Gauntlet, just because you have these different character classes, they have their own strengths and weaknesses. It just kind of feels like that. At least that's where my mind went when I was playing it. Much like Knights of the Round, King of the Dragons was released by Capcom in the arcades in 1991. It was ported to the Super Nintendo in 1994. Sometimes I wonder, or at least while I was playing this and Knights of the Round, I was wondering why Capcom waited so long to port these to the Super Nintendo. It's just a little weird, because they waited 3 years to do it, but whatever. Interestingly, they didn't release this game or Knights of the Round on the Sega Genesis for whatever reason. This is one of the best beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo, and I kind of wish I had played it earlier and that I had played it in the arcades, because I never got a chance to do that either. The game does have a very simple story, one that you would kind of expect from a beat-em-up. The Red Dragon, Gildis, I think that's how you pronounce it, is attacking the kingdom of Mollis, and it's up to you, the player, to defeat him. There are some cutscenes in this that kind of give you the motivation to keep going, but by and large, it's not really important. Like many beat-em-ups, the story is just kind of there to give you a reason why things are going on. This is by and large a standard beat-em-up. You're moving from left to right, you're fighting a bunch of enemies, the screen will lock until you defeat all the enemies on the screen. You're going to be fighting a bunch of palette swaps of different enemies. It's fairly standard. In the arcades, you could play with more characters. In the Super Nintendo, you're just left with the 2-player mode. It's still pretty cool. Now, the leveling system and the 5 playable characters, along with its beautiful graphics, those kind of separate it from a crowd of other beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo. Capcom did a fantastic job with the Super Nintendo ports of this game. So your 5 playable characters are the fighter, the cleric, the dwarf, the elf, and the wizard. It's interesting that they're all there, and that's why it kind of feels a little bit like Gauntlet to me, because you have those same characters in Gauntlet, or at least versions of those characters. King of the Dragons has a leveling system to it. A character's weapons and armor will get upgraded once you pick up different items, but then as you gain more points in the game, you'll actually level up. And this will give you more health, it might make you stronger, that sort of thing. It's kind of fun to see, the points in the game actually mattering, because otherwise it's just, they're there, but they don't really do a whole lot aside from giving you an extra life. They do that here, but then they also act as experience points. I also like when you upgrade your weapons and your shield or your armor, it gives you like this visual indication that your character has gotten stronger. It's pretty great. I like that it changes over time, much like how Knights of the Round did. Like other beat-em-ups, there are some items that you can pick up during the game. They're fairly standard, your health and your bonus points. And then you also have these 5 crystals that basically act as your magic, because your super attack in this is not very good, and you only really get one of them. So, yeah, the super attack is kind of pointless in this. This is the opposite effect of where I hate it when a super attack takes away life, but I really hate it when they only give you one of them. That's just as bad. Just because they could give you more than that and give you the option to find more throughout the level, but they don't really do that. So the 5 crystals, they are Meteor, Thunder, Firewall, Frog, and Crystal. Each one does different things. Meteor, Lightning, and Fire, they'll attack the enemies and do damage to them. Frog will turn the enemies into frogs, and Crystals turns them into crystals. That's kind of fun. At its core, though, this is just a standard beat-em-up. You're moving through some fairly short levels, the game's not particularly long, and you fight bosses and mini-bosses. There are a bunch of enemies that are palette swapped. It's not anything amazing, but it's done so well, and the few things that have been added to it work really well with this game. Like just about every arcade game, it slowly does get more difficult as you go through it. You're also getting stronger though, so that's a nice way to just mitigate how tough the game could actually be. It's a very nice balance. The gameplay feels very good for a 1990s beat 'em up. King of the Dragons has everything you should expect from a beat 'em up, and Capcom did an excellent job with it. I also like the fact that this is a two-player game. It seems like Capcom kind of figured out that they messed up with the first Final Fight by only making it single player. This is a very good looking game. The sprites were reduced in size from the arcade, which is kind of an understandable thing that they had to do. You just couldn't do that with the home console. There would be a lot more slowdown with the game if they did that. So yeah, having smaller sprites might seem like a bad idea, but at least for the home console, it works pretty well. While they aren't as detailed as, they could be when I'm comparing it to the arcade, because I can do that, thankfully, when I have the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle, they still look really good for the Super Nintendo. For the home console, the character sprites all look really good. The enemies look pretty decent, even though you do have a few palette swaps. It works well for the game. And it's what you should expect from a beat 'em up. That's generally how they did things back then, so whatever. The boss characters look great. Those are still reduced in size, but they're still very big and everything that you would expect from a beat 'em up. I know I've said that a few times, but that's pretty much how I feel with this game. It's everything you should expect, but it's done very well. Cutscenes are used to kind of explain what's happening in the game. They look okay. They really aren't anything special. It's just after the level, you'll occasionally have somebody show up, or a tree will come to life. And then a little text box will pop up to explain what's going on. You've got the world map that sort of tells you what's happening, where you're going, so you should, in theory, expect to see something somewhat relevant to the space on the map. So that's kind of nice for what it is. It's, again, not anything amazing, but it works pretty well for 1994, and it worked really well for 1991. The graphics are excellent in this game. King of the Dragons is a wonderful looking Super Nintendo game. If you want to see what the arcade game looks like, then you should check it out on Capcom's Beat 'em Up bundle, or one of the other Capcom arcade compilations. It's great that those are there, so then you can see what the game was supposed to look like in the arcades, instead of getting a vague idea of what was supposed to happen in the Super Nintendo port. It's also a lot cheaper to get those arcade compilations than it is to get your hands on the Super Nintendo version, which is good, but I don't think you need to spend the money to go get it. King of the Dragons is a beautiful game. It plays really well, and it's a lot of fun. I like this as much as I like Knights of the Round, and I like both of those games much more than, the Final Fight games, which are good, but I prefer the Streets of Rage games over those. Playing these on the Super Nintendo was the only way for me to, experience them back in the 1990s. Unfortunately, I didn't have an arcade anywhere near me, and I wasn't exactly following video game releases when I was 10. It's one of those things that often gets forgotten when people talk about retro games on the internet. They assume that everyone had Nintendo Power, or everyone somehow knew what video games were being released. That's bullshit. Not everybody did that. A lot of us did other things. And if you're like me, you had to rely on your friends to tell you what games were coming out, and hopefully they rented them, because I didn't have a Super Nintendo or a Genesis back then, and had to go over to my friend's house to play them. No one knew about every video game when it was released. Not everyone had subscriptions to Nintendo Power, or really any other video game magazine. Like I said, a lot of people learned about them from their friends groups, or just some random kid at school who happened to be talking about it at lunchtime. King of the Dragons is a game I wish I had known about back in the 1990s and also in the 2000s when I was collecting games. I first read about this from Pat Contry's Ultimate Guide to the Super Nintendo, and I'm glad I did because it's a wonderful beat 'em up. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.